All right, so since it's noon, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure that people are going to continue to filter in, but I'm just going to start off with a little introduction to the museum and the speaker series before we get into our main event. So Decoding the Past is an ongoing speaker series hosted by the Paul Gray PC Museum at Claremont Graduate University. My name is Anna Atkinson, and I'm the museum's executive director and a recent graduate of the master's program in cultural and museum studies at CGU. So for today's session, Digital Queers and Cyber Activism, the Early LGBTQ plus Internet, we're hosting a conversation with our guest, Alex Ketchum, assistant professor at McGill University's Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, as well as our moderator, Karen Wickre, author and longtime observer of corporate culture and the internet. So I'd like to start today by sharing a brief introduction to the Paul Gray Personal Computing Museum. The museum's founder, Paul Gray, arrived at Claremont in 1983 to establish the Center for Information Systems and Technology, better known today as CISAT. While founding CISAT here at CGU, Professor Gray also began amassing a collection of personal computers. His collection focused on tracking changes in computer technology with an eye for its relationships with people. After an 18-year career at CGU, Gray retired in 2001 and founded the Paul Gray Personal Computing Museum, donating his collection to CGU in the hopes that friends, colleagues, and students would build upon his work. Today, the museum traces the history of personal computing over the last 50 years, always with Paul Gray's original focus on how computers transform our lives in mind. Thanks to the transdisciplinary collaboration between CISAT and the School of Arts and Humanities, the museum continues to flourish by developing new partnerships, resources, and programming like today's Decoding the Past. You can check out a list of our previous Decoding the Past events on our event page. I will drop the link in the chat right now. So if you go to this page, you'll see a list of all the previous events we've had, and also new ones will be announced here. You can access recordings for old events here as well. Additionally, if you subscribe to our blog, which you can do from the blog drop-down menu in our navigation bar on the same site, you'll then get email notifications of new event announcements. If you follow that link, you will also see an option to donate to the museum on the right of the page. If you're able, I'd really like to encourage you to consider a donation of any amount. Donations help ensure the continued success of the museum and events like this one, while providing CGU students like myself with an opportunity for professional growth. So, all right, now let's get to the main event. On behalf of the museum, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, Karen Wickre. Karen is a veteran connector, editor, and communicator based out of Silicon Valley. As a corporate writer, Karen has developed stories, styles, and cadence for Google, Twitter, and many startups. More recently, she has served as an advisor for a range of companies, developing strategies for their messaging and the content they produce. A strong supporter of journalists and journalism, Karen serves on the boards of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships at Stanford and the News Literacy Project. And in 2018, she published Taking the Work Out of Networking, an introvert's guide to making connections that count. So thank you to Karen for joining us today and for all the work that you've put into this event. I'll go ahead and pass the mic to you after a quick reminder that we will be opening up for audience questions around 45 minutes in. So feel free to use the Q&A section throughout the event if any questions come to mind, and we'll handle it at the end of the event and, take a look at what you've contributed and what you've had to ask. All right, with that said, take it away, Karen. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Anna, and hi, everybody. I see some familiar names on the call, which is awesome. I do want to introduce Alex, and we maybe don't have enough time for her entire bio because she has done a lot. But and I will say this is a fascinating subject. I can't wait to get into it. She's a professor at McGill University. And she has a long history of studying, I would guess, I would say outlying and interesting subcultures. She's done a lot of study of different pockets of feminism over time. And she's writing her third monograph, which is what led us to today. The title, tentatively titled, Digital Queers, TechnoDykes, High-Tech Gays, and Lavender Bytes, as a good academic title has. A history of American, Canadian, and British LGBTQ plus cyber activism, 1992 to 2002. And we're going to come back to why those dates are important. And so it's underway. And Anna, Alex, sorry, you can maybe tell us more about the monograph and about your ongoing work at McGill. So please get us started.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me, Karen. It's such an honor to be speaking to you. It's also amazing. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I see some familiar names in the room, including folks that I've interviewed for the book and plan to. So Tom and AJ, and it's also great to see Jenny here as well. So thank you, everyone, for your time. Yeah, and I'm really excited to talk about this book project. So the title, of course, tentative and kind of a working title, and the time range has also changed a little bit. But I'll just give kind of a brief overview of the book, and it will allow us to kind of go into more detail. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so basically what I'm interested in tracking is the kind of nitty-gritty history of how LGBTQ plus organizations moved online, right? Sometimes I think we just take these technological histories for granted, but there was a lot of different labor done by a lot of different activists that made that possible. Karen is one of those activists, so that's why it's so exciting to be speaking with her today. I situate this history actually now starting in 1980 by looking at the history of associations of lesbian and gay engineers, scientists, and high-tech professionals. There are quite a few kind of national and local organizations that were actually advocating for the rights for security clearances, for like, it's anachronistic to say LGBTQ plus, but please just go with me on this rather than each time having to differentiate between lesbian, gay, and like when terminology changes. So I'm just going to put that as an asterisk. But basically for the kind of larger queer community to have workers' rights, this kind of led into the development and support of employee resource groups that were focused on the issues of lesbian and gay employees and kind of larger LGBTQ issues around harassment policies and non-discrimination policies, as well as spousal and partner support, spousal later, of course, but partner support, and around kind of HIV and AIDS activism as well on the company side. Some of this work done by employee resource groups was shared by different organizations outside of specific companies. So I look at groups like Apple Lambda, HP Glen, Microsoft Gleam, et cetera. But also the work of organizations such as High-Tech Gays, which was a Silicon Valley organization for like lesbian and gay employees, and then kind of the development of digital queers, which is a big part of what we'll be talking about today. So for those of you who don't know, and I know some of you in this room were members of Digital Queers, and Karen, one of the co-founders, and Tom, who's also here on the call, the other co-founder. But Digital Queers was a really important organization that is highly understudied, and I feel so grateful to be able to share some of the amazing work that they did. So on one hand, there was a kind of initial work starting like around 1992. It's very strange to tell the history of the people who did it to them right now, but for the other audience members, around 1992 in terms of helping like establish some of these employee resource group initiatives and kind of share strategies of how to approach the C-suite, how to organize workers and so forth, but also a push that was needed to help kind of LGBTQ organizations join the internet revolution. Many nonprofits, community organizations were using secondhand computers, didn't have hardware, software training. So Digital Queers was really, really vital in distributing modems. There was a modem pool fundraising first for large organizations, also like the NGLTF, like the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, groups such as Frameline, the LGBTQ like film festival, and many other groups. And when you actually look through the documents, which I have in archives, Digital Queers is everywhere during this period. If you look at grant application, you can just see like queer organizations across the United States, like trying to get modems and so forth. And so I really think that Digital Queers was so vital in helping support a lot of the information and communication work of queer organizations in the United States. And then kind of the later parts of the book kind of talk about other ways that the queer community supported other queer organizations online. So groups including like doing information activism, which is Kate McKinney's term for like basically sharing information. And so the creation of internet guidebooks targeted to the LGBTQ community, creating courses, workshops. Some of that work was done by Digital Queers, but I also talk about other organizations doing this work. And then the kind of book project ends by thinking about lesbian and gay queer archives and how they were both organizations assisted by groups such as Digital Queers in terms of getting modems and so forth, but also how they've been preserving this history and making this research also possible. So I know that's long and detailed, but that's kind of the trajectory of the project. So 1980 to really 2002 is kind of like the main set, but the kind of end chapter and then the conclusion kind of brings us to today. And the bulk is really kind of around 1992 or really 91, like the rise of the World Wide Web and kind of the new internet.
That is a lot. Take a breath.
Yeah, I know. I tried to do it succinctly, but
That's a lot.
it's big.
Well, I want to ask you to remind us all, because I know many of us were there, but at the same time, we also forget the state of the online world in the early 90s, right? It was, when you talk about modems, like how many people in the US, say, or in North America, do you know were online at all or had access to the internet? And by the way, it wasn't the internet then, it was you got on through a one service or another typically, which included AOL, and that had played an important role. But anyway, like paint a picture for us of what that state was like and why the community was online relatively early.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of around like 1992, we're seeing like different kind of forms of internet use. So for folks who aren't aware, right, 1969 is the launch of ARPANET by the US military and university campuses, kind of collaboration. And we see different versions of kind of early internet. We see Usenet and BBS, which are bulletin board systems, which continue to be used in the like early 90s as well. And actually some people still use BBS, like Echo New York, still you can actually join. But these are kind of functioning similar to kind of message boards. And then 1991, the World Wide Web is launched, but that doesn't mean people are necessarily online on the World Wide Web. It takes a couple years. You know, even in the early 90s, as Karen has previously talked about in some interviews, you could go to every website that existed in an afternoon. You know, it was kind of everywhere. Like it was actually possible to write a guide of the entire internet and list every website. We kind of see an initial kind of the walled garden model with like AOL, for example, was really useful in terms of doing some community building. AOL had some support for lesbian and gay communities in some of the different like rooms. But we really see kind of like a big kind of push in terms of popular culture, in terms of uptake, in terms of people starting to purchase more internet time around 95, 96. That's when we really see like a shooting up beyond kind of people who are already kind of early adopters of tech. And then it really, really like picks up, right? And we have the big .com boom and then later bust and then another kind of boom. So what this means is that kind of in the early 90s, you have a huge gap in terms of folks who know how to use these internet technologies. There's a lot of excitement, but there's a lot of like, what is the internet? What could it be used for? Some people are trepidatious. There's a concern that the far right has started to make use of these spaces. But as the internet, even like BBS, right, had been useful for folks to come out, kind of like first have a space where they could talk about being lesbian or gay for the first time in a semi-anonymous way. It had also always been really important for kind of lesbian, gay, queer, trans community building. And I just want to give a shout out to some really important work that's being done on this topic from the trans perspective, especially Avery Dame Griff's book, The Two Revolutions about the Transgender Internet is great. It came out last year, highly recommend. But yeah, so really like groups such as Digital Queers, really, I would say Tom and Karen really saw like, wow, there's a lot of potential here, and like really wanted to help bring in a queer community organizations in particular online. So not just on the individual level, but like, how can we do these like mass communications? And so there's a lot of excitement. I think we've all seen kind of some of the promises of the internet haven't all played out as we hoped, but there was a lot of great stuff.
I want to just say that the idea of connecting with people, as you say, who didn't live near you, and before AOL and some of the others, Prodigy and CompuServe and those, there were also Usenet groups. There was
Yes.
BBSs and Usenet groups. And I think that's maybe the first way I became aware that these Usenet groups covered a million topics, and they were, asynchronous discussion groups. So maybe say a little about that, because one thing I know that's important about that is Tom Jennings created FidoNet. Tom was a queer skateboarder and I guess white hat hacker in a sense at that time in San Francisco, and FidoNet became an early tool for Usenet and other for online activism, I guess.
Yes, definitely. And I also want to point to the work of Kat Brewster, who is writing specifically on Usenet and gay BBSs, mostly within the US context. But yeah, so these were places where there would be ones that were particularly for the gay community. People would dial in and be able to like meet others outside of their area. And there were networks of both like shared gay BBSs and then also individual that were like more localized. Right. And this is a place where people could explore their own identities, meet other people. And it also breaks up some of that kind of false binary we see between online and offline, where it was actually, pretty common in terms of what people have shared, if like that they would meet people on a BBS and then like meet in person at some point too, and seeing like, oh, there's someone who shares my identity, someone who's had a similar experience, someone who shares my feelings. For my own book project, well, like I am talking about some of like the value of the internet for like kind of the individual experience. And there's a lot of kind of journalism in the 90s within kind of like lesbian and gay periodicals about this. I'm really concerned within the book project about how community organizations moved online. So it's kind of a thread with my work. I previously wrote about the history of like basically lesbian and queer women's feminist restaurants in the US and Canada from 1972 to 2022. And kind of a thread of all of my work is how people organized together, the way that they created spaces from a kind of like not for profit, even if they don't have that status, kind of perspective of bringing people together more than the individual experience without neglecting how important that could be.
That makes me think, and let's segue a little bit to organizations that were very much offline, although they used online tools like ACT UP and the 93 March on Washington and things like that. How do you see them making use of online tools, or how did they sort of combine the real world plus the internet in those early days?
Yeah, so in the kind of early days, I think there's a few things that we see. So first of all, there's the kind of communications from organizations themselves, whether they're choosing to use flyers or publish in lesbian and gay periodicals. But then there's also the way that individuals are sharing information, especially on listservs. So something that I look at a lot in my research is, I'm not sure if people remember this, but it was really common to print out your emails. And so in a lot of archives, especially from 92 to 2002, it seems like people kind of stopped printing out their emails primarily by 2002. But there's all these printed emails that people sharing like, hey, are you going to go to the March on Washington? Like, and sharing it on listservs and in that kind of way. So I think in terms of communications, while we see organizations start to get more and more online by like kind of well, 94, 95, really growing 96 through like 99. That's like when we see a really big push. We see the way that people who are already online are sharing the information that they're receiving in like letters, or people are typing up news articles that they saw on it. So yeah, and other kinds of activism. So for example, I initially didn't plan to make this the book. The book was originally actually going to be about the history of feminist reactions to the development of AI technologies. And you might think, wow, that is quite the departure.
Another book.
Yeah, very different project. But I was like kind of like through kind of like a queer feminist perspective. And what I kept finding were these mentions of digital queers in some of these printed emails when I was looking for stuff. And it would be like, oh, we're going to have an event at like Disney World, or oh, we're going to have this. And like the way that people are kind of sharing this information from their personal email accounts to like share the work of organizations. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I'm doing a different research project right now and also finding literally flyers designed for phone polls, but they would have an email address or and a phone number, just around that same period. So it is interesting to see.
It's very exciting. Just one note that like, especially seeing the shift of the time of like when organizations start to list an email address and when they start to list a website. So I started noting that down. So like one of the case studies in my book is around Dyke TV. For those who don't know, it was a New York-based television project run by and for lesbians and dykes, and kind of a in a very broad understanding of what it means to be a dyke. And yeah, so when they first start to mention like they're being on Echo, and then when they mention the website and stuff like that, and you can kind of map out the history through some of that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was the Wayback Machine helpful for you in your research to find
Yeah,
some
so
of
the Wayback Machine, for I think a lot of people on the call might know, but the Internet Wayback Machine, which is available through the Internet Archive, takes snapshots of the internet at different periods of time, different websites, and the frequency can vary based off of the website. It is really useful to see different versions of a website, but sometimes like JPEGs aren't preserved or certain formatting is off. But it was helpful for looking at some of the materials from Dyke TV. When they started to put video online. You can't watch the video, but you can see like a version of it. And in some cases, websites weren't preserved because not everything is like captured. And the other thing is, for folks who are interested in doing this research, social media isn't captured. So like certain proprietary websites, like especially social media, isn't preserved in the same way. So that can be tricky, but yeah.
That's actually another fascinating topic is how to find these things, because you really dug in. One thing I want to touch on is sort of the rise of AOL during this period, because again, a lot of us may be vaguely familiar with it, but it became kind of the behemoth of the online services, and did have these communities. That one early one, which I think some of the audience can speak to in more detail, was how friendly AOL was to having a gay and lesbian community on AOL. And we who are old enough remember millions of discs, CDs being mailed to us seemingly every day to get on AOL, right? To join AOL. And that's part of what caused their popularity and their boom. And that is one of the tools then that DQ used to have sort of basic AOL training for all of these organizations to get online. Right. So do you want to just talk a little bit about AOL in particular? Because I think it played an important role here.
Yeah, for sure. So again, like as you mentioned, there's certain audience members who I'm like basing this off of and their own experiences, and like especially like Tom and Jenny in the audience right now. And like with Planet Out, like on AOL as well. But yeah, so in going through archival materials and in interviews, folks have said that they found that like AOL was pretty receptive to having like gay organizations, kind of chat rooms online. There wasn't kind of this push against. Of course, like in kind of this early walled internet period, we're also seeing the rise of the kind of discourse about like protect the children from like these salacious materials, and how different companies reacted to that, and especially like around court cases. And so AOL overall was like pretty supportive of the lesbian and gay and like larger like trans and queer community, although there are discussions of sometimes like when different like chat rooms and stuff get blocked, and also like within certain like fetish communities as well online. But one thing that has been really interesting looking at AOL is because and like seeing interviews with like Tom and with you of talking about how receptive AOL was that when you were doing these kinds of workshops, such as at the Creating Change conferences held by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, where 2,000 activists were going to, and you were having these how-to internet workshops, and you printed these like guidebooks essentially. And you know, you also said, and we distributed discs of AOL, and we had our friend come down and bring discs of AOL. And I'm younger, but I remember also like that intersects with my own life trajectory in terms of like going to Blockbuster, getting the free AOL, getting it in the mail all the time. But how you saw that AOL was quite user friendly. BBS and Usenet could feel pretty scary. Digital Queers had like co-produced a zine about how to use Gopher. And, you know, when you read through that, like that could be quite off-putting, right? The technical details versus like AOL. I was using that when I was 6 years old, right? And I could navigate the website quite.
And AOL wanted that, by the way. I mean, this is part of their, they were supportive, but of course, they were all about growth during this period. Yeah.
And so it was like an invitation to use. And, you know, I think one of the important bits of work that like Digital Queers was doing, as well as some other organizations during this period, was like, how can we make the internet feel less scary? And how can we lower the bar for usage? And so AOL was really helpful in doing that. And then people could go beyond and do like additional workshops of creating the internet. And sometimes there were discussions of like, okay, people have come to our Internet 101 course. Let's now break off and have like working groups. So at New York City's The Center, which is the LGBTQ Center, there were these like workshops for the Internet 101 sponsored by Digital Queers, and then kind of like working groups that like met off of that. And some work by other kind of computer professionals with groups such as like Lavender Bytes and such.
You talked earlier about this, and I want to come back to it. The role that Silicon Valley companies played in terms of paying attention, maybe for the first time, to their gay employees, and these the employee groups that then sprung up to work on non-discrimination policies for their companies, and sort of professional, you know, in a professional setting, which was something DQ was interested in, and wanted to have some role with. The groups themselves, the companies, the groups in these companies also formed an organization to meet and talk about how their companies were treating and developing policies that helped their gay and lesbian employees. Do you want to talk about that some, if that's?
Are you talking about a group of groups, AGOG, or in terms of?
Yes, AGOG.
Yes. Okay. Yes, AGOG. So yeah, so AGOG appears in a few different places, like kind of within my research, and like folks that I saw be listed that they were at AGOG. Sometimes they remember, sometimes they don't. I mean, this is right. I'm talking about to people like, hey, do you remember going to this picnic in August in 1992? You know, like I don't know. Ask me about a picnic I went to last year. I don't know if I remember.
Right.
So, so yeah, a group of groups was one of the different organizations of trying to share strategies. So, like as you mentioned, right, there's a few different kind of Silicon Valley and San Francisco based employee resource groups. These groups first started, oftentimes they're started by employees. And sometimes were not officially recognized by their companies. Eventually, over time, many of the companies did recognize them. First, there were groups like Friends of Dorothy at HP that were more kind of social gatherings where, like, especially gay men within the company would meet, and there were pool parties, and it was just a way of like creating community. This actually, I think, is really important for community like building in order to allow for activism to happen, right? Trust has to be established, and knowing that other people exist and you can rely on them and like they're your friend is like kind of one of the first steps to then allow for like advocacy. From HP, there's also then the rise of HP Glen, which is the Gay and Lesbian Employee Network that starts to do a lot of this advocacy around like protection around the basis of sexual orientation.
Right. And benefits and such. Yeah.
Exactly. And then it's kind of like in multiple steps. So we see kind of advocacy in the 80s. And many of the companies are kind of like working on this in the 80s and kind of right around by 91, 92, a lot of the kind of tech companies have protection around sexual orientation. Most of the groups followed the trajectory of first around that protection and then around partner benefits. For a couple of reasons. One was that the sexual orientation policy didn't cost money to implement on the company side, whereas the partner benefits did have some costs, like around like insurance benefits. And so it kind of became this template. There's information sharing that's happening between different employee groups and also before employee groups are started. So there was discussions, people would come in as guest speakers at high-tech gays meetings. There were also, this is a little bit later, but there were conferences such as Out in the Workplace that were happening. A lot of these like meetings are happening around Stanford's campus and in Silicon Valley. And then there's also later a group of groups that begins to meet. But there's also sharing through newsletters across the country. So organizations such as Gay Tech, there's like kind of breakoffs of like the LeGays, which is the Lesbian and Gay Association of Engineers and Scientists, which is where high-tech gays actually came from. There's a lot of like letter writing and articles. If you look at a lot of like smaller LGBTQ like periodicals from this period, there's like tiny articles that are like, we're trying to start a group, or like, does anyone have ideas, or here's how we did it, and interview. So there's on lots of different levels, people are working together, but we see a lot of important wins that are happening in the tech sector. And one of the reasons I think this is happening is because the value of these employees, right? They're highly trained, highly skilled employees that companies want to retain. And like at Apple Lambda and like Elizabeth Birch and Bennett Marks are making the argument like, hey, this is actually good for your bottom line as well. So there's this kind of argument like, hey, you're going to retain employees, you're going to attract employees, even if they're not like lesbian or gay, maybe it's people who care about the protections of lesbian and gay employees, and they'll come to the group, to the company, and want to stay. So there's a lot of economic arguments that are being made, and then these strategies are shared.
Yeah, it was interesting, I think, to see it. The tech companies maybe being based in Northern California, maybe having a tradition of, if not acceptance, tolerance, and a garden of ideas and all that kind of thing over the years, that it was maybe easier for tech companies to have that sort of live and let live, expression in their policies, and then eventually to see bigger companies and East Coast companies and more standard.
Yeah, and I want to say that like while like part of it is like, yes, these tech companies were some of the first, and that's really important, is that like there was resistance from a lot of them at first. And like I have gone through documentation from management as well as like employees from those companies that are filled with homophobic and transphobic comments and like initial resistance and rejection to these policies. So, I mean, it's like great that they adapted this, but I think it's also really due to the ongoing advocacy of the employees doing that work at the company, that like these were not top-down decisions, but really because of like,
Right.
but like, I mean, it's great that they learned and like change policies. And the other part of this story too, right, is that how important so many gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, trans people have been the development of a lot of our digital technologies. People who may have been closeted at the time, some people came out during this period, and sometimes like CEOs later coming out or being outed in the case of like the Apple CEO. So like, this is kind of a complicated interwoven history, but yeah, like tech companies were some of the first kind of major corporations to do a lot of this work. Yeah, and I originally wasn't planning to make a history that was so California based, but California is pretty pivotal. But Lotus was also really important in terms of partner benefits, and that's a Boston-based company. So
That's right. That's right. There was, and oddly, I've met a phalanx of gay men who'd worked at Lotus who then came to San Francisco later. But they've been very active in that group. I want to shout out here. AJ has posed an interesting comment for you. He says, "I want to do a shout out to the unions, the collective bargaining groups, who were integral to getting benefits to the less tech skilled worker groups as well."
yes, thank you, AJ, for that shout out. And AJ, former president of High Tech Gays, also who I had the pleasure of interviewing for the book. Yeah, this is really in many ways a labor history. It's a queer history and a labor history and a history of technology.
And how about on the activism side? How do you see the arc of activism once we all had these online tools and more people were in fact being online, coming online? How do you see the effectiveness of reach, of collective action, of in-person action? Where do you see all that going?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so kind of like as I mentioned, right, there's a lot of like initial like hopes of what the internet will bring. And in some ways it's great. You can have a campaign and you can let people know we're going to gather at this place tomorrow and get a lot of people there really fast, right? While phone trees useful, maybe not the same breadth of reach, but to like get information out quickly. It's also was a lot cheaper than sending out all of those mailers, right? That was quite expensive and time consuming. Of course, what we've seen over time is now we're inundated with so many emails, social media posts, right? Algorithms of the social media companies also really impact what we see. And there's a lot of work showing that like queer and trans content is not shown as much by the algorithms. So in some ways, then the reliance on these digital technologies also starts to like become a little less useful. And that's why we also then see kind of the rise again of like in person and this kind of like blurring of the in person and digital. But one thing that I look at in chapter 5 of the book, I want to say, is how in kind of the early mid 90s, organizations are navigating using multiple technologies for communication simultaneously. So for example, looking at gay phone lines and calling lines, where they're still having like kind of like the change of when you're having everyone calling in and volunteers are like having to go to like a bookshelf or a directory or a printed folder to share information, and then the creation of databases to look this up. And then they start to recommend websites and kind of that blurring. And then when there starts to be a mix of like, or you could email in your questions, or you can do like a live instant messenger, and like the kinds of new challenges as you're trying to work with multiple technologies simultaneously. It requires a lot of upskilling too. That can be a lot of work. And so that's part of the story I'm trying to tell, is like how people learn these skills and shared these skills, because there was a lot of work behind that. So that's the kind of like information activism angle in creating the guidebooks, in creating like the book that you wrote, right? Where it's not necessarily like a gay guide to the internet, though you did have screenshots of gay websites throughout the book, which I really appreciated, kind of like hidden there. But yeah, organizing these courses, teaching them, all of that.
There were a couple of, Tom may remember this more than me, but or somebody else, there were a couple of published gay guides to the
Yes.
internet, to the web.
Yeah, yes, for sure. There's Jeff Dawson, who wrote
Yes.
several gay guides to the internet. There was also a few, so there's like kind of a series of them. Library of Congress fortunately has copies, and I've also amassed a personal collection of these because I like to study every edition change. Because I was curious to see how they changed of talking over BBS versus walled gardens versus World Wide Web. But yeah, there are also guidebooks focused like directed at women, but these oftentimes had a large section for like lesbians and bi women. So there was Surfer Girls, there's Look Ethel, an internet guidebook for us, which was Surfer Girls. Yeah, there's like quite a few. So off the top of my head, besides the Jeff Dawson guide, and then there's a few other ones that were linked with like the Advocate, also kind of co-sponsored one. And these are quite large books. And they kind of speak to this larger history of the listing of websites, in which there are websites that listed other websites to visit, because before search was really that useful, right? Like, I mean, Google's become a little bit less useful now, but Google was like really important. But like prior, there wasn't that great indexing like through search, right? Like I think about like Ask Jeeves and even prior searches.
Dogpile.
Yeah, one of the Archie, which was an important search, was actually developed by a gay man of color, and was like also an important part of kind of gay internet history as well. But yeah, so these like printed lists were really important, listservs, sharing lists of websites, and also a lot of like publications, especially lesbian publications, would have recurring features of here's websites to check out, and it would be published every month, just so people would know about them. So prior to like useful search.
Yeah, new websites were coming online then with some frequency. And so then it would be in these printed publications have a roundup of the latest new websites.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I've done a kind of like database tracking of looking through every edition of certain like periodicals, like Girlfriends, Curve, Deneuve, and so forth, to kind of systematically look at how they track them. And they would have like kind of catchy names of the features, but also just kind of more broad searches as well. Like even the Advocate had like a section. Those kind of came more like late 90s, early 2000s. But again, this like, it's, you know, it's reaching different kinds of audiences and assumptions of who's accessing like websites, right? You have the folks who are the early adapters getting information through kind of listservs and some of these internet guidebooks, and then kind of later adapters through kind of more popular culture medium.
Yeah. And I know you said 12:45, but I feel like we have such a knowledgeable group of participants. Maybe we can start getting in some questions and comments from other historians of the period.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody, oh, we've already got one. Awesome. So I'll go ahead and read it out. Just a comment. This is also similar to the printed out emails. Your email stash wasn't available in your pocket. So like we don't have, you know, now we have our smartphones and our email right with us all the time, but you know,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so like, I mean, I think it's one of the things, this is kind of going off of your comment, AJ, a bit, and kind of taking it in a slightly different direction, but like one of the kind of lovely things with writing about this period is like there are still physical traces. Digital archiving of these kinds of materials, especially like of LGBTQ, like digital materials, is like not that great. When we look at most kind of queer archives or community archives that are under-resourced, understaffed, oftentimes volunteer run, and like we know how to preserve paper, but like file formats change all the time. Like you don't really just want to archive someone's entire inbox, right? So it's kind of tricky, but like, you know, people who are printing out emails, sometimes annotating on notes. Like I've looked at emails that Karen, you printed and then wrote notes on about whether or not you were going to give someone a modem or not, or wrote their phone number on it, right? Like that is a really valuable resource. And we don't really do that. People sometimes think that because so many things are digitized, they're easy to search, they're easy to find. But, you know, companies are like now starting to like erase like email accounts that are no longer being used, all of that like data is being lost. And so there's actually a big concern within archival communities and historical communities that we actually might have like very few materials left over from this period of like this kind of activism. And you, like Karen, you were saying like how useful it was to look at like printed posters for telephone poles. And like, you know, my work from this about the 70s and 80s, you know, like it's like Sharpie on a piece of paper and photocopy type of stuff or handwritten stuff. And like that is preserved. I can touch it, I can feel it. But a social media account, like if you were sharing stuff on MySpace, gone. Twitter/X, pretty much going away. Like Library of Congress had saved a big amount of Twitter, but a lot, not new stuff. Instagram, not archived. And like, even if people are taking screenshots for their own use of a site, like of like one Instagram page, like how is that going to be preserved? So it's going to actually be really tricky to write about some of these activist efforts, especially of underfinanced kind of grassroots organizations.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Jenny has a question for you, Alex. Can you see that?
Yeah.
So I'll read it out.
Oh, yeah. Do you want to read it out loud and then, yeah.
Jenny's asked, on that note, do you have any advice about archiving digital materials? So like how to get stuff out of one's ancient Mac laptop. And so for Jenny, it's that has like her old Planet Out emails with Karen and Tom. So
yeah, for sure. Okay, so so this is like a particular obsession of mine about like emailing or of archiving emails for LGBTQ archive. So I created a directory of every LGBTQ archive in the US and Canada, like independent and then also like collections. So if you go to, I believe it's, let me double check the URL before I mention it to everyone on the chat, but I think it's just lgbtqarchives.com. Yes, it is. So if you go to lgbtqarchives.com, yeah, archives.com, you'll see this directory. It's a very, very simple website. But and so I messaged every archivist at these archives and said, like, how do you deal with emails? Like, how are you kind of dealing with this? And basically all of them said, we don't really have a way of dealing with emails on our side. So even though there are efforts kind of at large institutional archives to do some email preservation, it's still pretty early stages and quite limited. But one thing I would suggest doing is reaching out to the archive that you want to give the materials to and ask if they want printed emails. Maybe they are starting to take, like, since I surveyed them last year, maybe they're starting to take some digitized emails, but I would reach out. So a lot of DQ's materials, like the main materials, are at the GLBT Historical Society. And there's an amazing archivist there who I think would have suggestions on like where to share it, and like how to share it. And maybe might even say like, hey, maybe we can print some and put it in a full that's like easily accessible next to the DQ one. That would be my suggestion. And maybe Jenny, we can talk more when we're having our meeting later about some of the Planet Out stuff. But yeah, I think really like printed paper can be useful. I know it's not like what people think is the ideal, but it really is a lot easier to preserve.
I'm getting a text from Tom. Tom, you want to put in a question or comment to the chat?
Yeah, so to the Q&A, we can't like enable people speaking in a webinar, like to the speakers are like set beforehand, differently than a meeting. So if you could send your question through the Q&A, or comment through the Q&A, that would be awesome. Thank you.
And also for folks whose personal histories I'm talking about, it's always the tricky thing of writing histories where everyone's still alive and can speak back. So if there's a part of your history you feel like I'm misrepresenting, one part of my historical practice is when I interview people, I share what I've written about them to them so they can like speak to it again or let me know if I've made mistakes or misinterpreted something. But you know, I'm trying to do justice to this important activist and labor history. But you know, there's lots of you who have your own experiences and stuff. So if also people have suggestions, you can put that in the Q&A. Yeah.
Yeah, the box should be along, if you can't find it, right along the bottom bar of your screen. Yeah, sorry, Tom, I would enable your video audio to ask a question, but it just, you can't do it in a webinar. I'm sorry.
Or Karen, can you read the text out loud if it's a question?
Tom raised his hand, and so Tom, can you?
Oh, it came in.
Here it
Oh,
goes. how we
Oh,
work.
okay. But yeah, I would like, so, oh wait, did you want to read what Tom said and then I can kind of
Oh,
speak to this?
yeah, absolutely. So Tom made a comment about how we worked improvisationally, trying stuff and then refine. So an iterative process of figuring things out. Uh,
Yeah, so I just want to speak to that. So I have a lot of respect to like for all of the work that you both were doing, and also like the many people who are also supporting you within DQ, and like how transparent you've been about your process, about like trying different things and like seeing which route would work, and kind of collaborating with different people too, and kind of using their different knowledges about organizations, working with lawyers in some situations, working with insiders at companies, finding employees who might be amenable, like upper level, like managers who might be amenable to assisting. You know, like I didn't really talk about this in detail, but one of the places you do see like DQ kind of popping up most frequently in a lot of archives is around the Macworld parties. And like,
Mm,
you know, like this is so for those who don't know, like DQ used to host these like parties that were like fundraisers. Robin Williams did like a comedy like routine one time. There was like a really cool one with like this interactive art, or at least it sounded cool in like the reading of the description of like kind of cyber art. But were these great ways of fundraising for hardware and software for like some of these larger community organizations. And then of course later, like because like not they couldn't throw a party for every organization, they also had the modem pool. So different ways of fundraising, community building, kind of the initial thing where Tom was going around the floor of Macworld and like saying like, hey, do you have any like samples you can give us and we can share? So but yeah. And then yeah, and I really think like the other point that Tom made about how much this is coming from like the employees rather than kind of the C-suite earlier on, of
yeah.
seeing that these companies are like the work is like by and for the employees. And this is kind of another part of the book. Maybe it's not like the like one of the sexiest arguments in the book, but is also about the way that when employee resource groups get institutionalized by some of these companies, some of the power gets taken away a little bit, like when it's being run by the employees without so much like oversight by upper management, there's the ability to like advocate a lot more. And so we see this in terms of like name change of some of these organizations when they become institutionalized, and also the kinds of campaigns that they're able to undertake. So it's always that challenge within activism, right? Of insider, outsider, of like where you can create change and like operating on multiple levels, which is why I'm a big advocate for trying to create change in lots of different ways, and that there's not like a single route, but instead like having lots of folks use their skill sets and kind of attacking the issue with those sets across.
Totally. So Tom's also commented that like humor and design were some of the most important tools, and that Karen and Tom are communication pros. So know how to take something that's super nerdy and make it easy to digest for a wider audience, and for less techie people.
Definitely. So for folks who don't know, DQ had some really great t-shirts and taglines. So we're here, we're queer, and we have email, as well as click and drag queen, a lot of really like kind of fun phrases, and like speaking to like it's not a bug, it's a feature. So yeah, like really kind of, I would say one of the really amazing things that like one of the amazing skills of both Tom and Karen was being able to work with the media on different levels, and to get the message kind of more broadly shared. So within kind of tech magazines and so forth. So maybe Anna or Karen, you can say like where the image from the poster that we used for this event is from, or maybe Karen, you want to speak to that just briefly.
Used a photo. Tom and I were featured in issue number 4 of Wired magazine, which launched in 1993. And by the way, when they launched, the founders, Louis and Jane, and some of the others from the team walked to Macworld Expo at Moscone Center to give away free copies. That's how sort of interconnected all that stuff was. But anyway, in issue number 4, there was a nice sort of half-page feature about DQ because Wired was interested in internet culture. I don't even think they called it that then, but it was just sort of the beginning of what interesting things are happening on the internet. So we had that. We had a nice business write-up in the New York Times, which sort of played off the notion of the Silicon Valley companies. It had a bit more of a business angle. And yes, and Tom is giving a shout out to our colleagues and predecessors, especially AJ Alfieri Crispin, who was then the new modern president, the postmodern president of High Tech Gays, which had earlier started largely for gay men who were working in the defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and so the old tech in Silicon Valley. And here came AJ to modernize and make it more cool. And then DQ, sort of on top of that. And Jenny, he says, Jenny, our hero, full stop. Absolutely. And back to the activism for a minute, I have to say a couple things. One is the activism was perhaps inspired in part, I know it was for Tom, by ACT UP. And ACT UP also was one of these it was grassroots, right? They were relentless and fearless about pushing, the doors open to all the halls of power. And that in itself will be studied for a long time because that's then how other medical and healthcare movements like breast cancer activism, they took their inspiration from ACT UP.
Definitely. And like one of the things too with like, even the name digital queers, right? Like some folks don't like the word queer being used, but like Thomas talked about like how Queer Nation was an inspiration as well. And I see also a question from AJ, which I can speak to, but maybe Anna, you want to read it aloud so audience members can see it, and then I can speak to that.
So AJ's asked, will you have any discussion or eventual research that details that once the corporate groups were established, that they often spurred people to get involved in politics, like working against Prop 8 in California?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's actually even before some of the corporate groups were established that this was happening. So it's kind of working simultaneously. So Bennett Marks has talked about like some of the things that inspired him around creating Apple Lambda and doing his advocacy. I'm not taking this out of context. I was like, should I change the way that I'm phrasing this? And then this is a direct quote he used in an interview with me, interviews on television, interviews in books, but he basically said he wanted to get the apathetic, rich, gay men at Apple to get more involved in politics. So I'm using his words, but he put it in lots of places. But basically he was really worried about the LaRoche initiatives, which were basically about sequestering people with HIV and AIDS and basically quarantining them. So like advocacy around or against that work. And then basically there's kind of this ongoing relationship of both trying to create change within the company and like training different kinds of activists who then go on to do other kind of activism on the level of the state and then later on the national, federal level. But it's kind of intertwined, and I do talk about this in the book, this kind of intertwining of both with trying and create change within your company while also working on these like kind of state policy issues. Yeah, it's part of this kind of like larger trajectory that I'm interweaving, both within California history, but also kind of national. And as was mentioned, this book also speaks to Canadian history and a bit of British history. But a lot of the earlier sections of the book are really a lot of like kind of American work. But what's interesting too is that kind of we see similar trajectories in Canada, and then like also a little bit in the UK. But yeah, they're kind of different case studies.
I just realized we haven't, you must tell us when the book will be out and available, who's publishing it?
Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah. So I don't know the date it will come out, but it's under contract with MIT Press. And so it will be available in open access as well as paperback. For me, it's really important that all of the work that I do around queer history is available in open access, which means people can read it for free online because so many people don't have access to queer histories. But you're also welcome to buy a copy. Um, I'm turning in the full manuscript in February, and then it will go out for peer review again. So the first 2 chapters were peer reviewed before I got the contract. And so, based off of how publishing works, I would say 2026, but we'll hopefully sooner. But I will also be sharing like other kinds of versions of this work. But this is actually my first public talk ever about the topic, like in a formal way. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity. But yeah, so I have about a chapter and a half left to write of the 8-chapter book.
And if people want to follow you, the best place would be your website.
Yeah, I would say in terms of like social media, if you're an Instagram user at Dr. Alex Ketchum, if I'm on Twitter, I still am keeping it Twitter X at aketchum22, but I'm pretty easy to Google, just Alex Ketchum. My website's alexketchum.ca. My email's there, my contact information. It's .ca because there's a YouTuber who likes to do silly stunts in Toronto that got .com. But if you put Alex Ketchum McGill, Alex Ketchum history, like my stuff will come up.
Okay.
Yeah. But thank you so much for doing that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. So we're out of time. So first I want to thank both of you so much for the work you put into this talk and being here, and everything that you've shared. And thank you to the audience for your time and questions and contributions. We really appreciate you being here. Just a reminder that this is an ongoing speaker series, so we will have more events. Look out for those. I realized that earlier at the beginning, I pasted the link to our events tab to hosts and panelists instead of to so I am pasting it in to everybody now, so that you do have access to our link. And this event is recorded. So if you ever want to reference it or want to send the recording to someone else, you will be able to find the recording on our website. We will also send a survey out about the event to everybody who was registered. So in a day or two, you'll get a survey, and we definitely, encourage you to answer it. If you want to take the time to do that, we'd really appreciate it. And thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed the program. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And also, sorry, Terry, I saw you had your hand up at one point. So if you want to send me an email, if you had a question, I'll be happy to write back. So I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to your question.
Totally fine. I texted Terry. It was just an accidental hand raise. So.
Oh, okay, cool. Awesome. Great. Well,
yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. This means a lot. And it was lovely to speak with you. And thank you everyone for your generous questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you for trusting me with your stories and history. So thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.